Hi folks, welcome to this video on the stages of learning. So what we're talking about here is going from an absolute beginner in a sport to an expert. Now there's various quotes that you'll hear about that in terms of how long it takes to go from beginner to expert, and some of the things that are thrown around are things like 10,000 hours or 10 years to go from a beginner or an expert. Now let's look at those two phrases, beginner and expert. Technically, what we're basically saying is a beginner is a cognitive performer. So they're the early stages of learning, or the first stage of learning. An autonomous performer is an expert, someone who plays that particular sport to a very high standard. Now a lot of people, obviously, you're going to fit somewhere, either be a beginner or an expert, or fit somewhere between the two. The ones that fit between the two, we call them associative performers. And as you can see here, there's a few little things about each one. So what we've got here is a cognitive performer has basic understanding of movement or skill. They make frequent errors, and they're still thinking of and learning the movements. So, very basic performers just getting a grasp, beginning their journey in this sport. Several hours, months, years later, they'll become associative performers, automatically as technique. I'll be talking about the majority of you out there can recognise and feel the errors themselves, so you know if you're making mistakes or not. And the errors that you do make are no longer major. And by the time you get to autonomous, expert performer, movements are automatic. You don't even have to think about them. And a lot of the time people say, because you don't have to think about the movements anymore, that frees up all your brain to focus on tactics and things like that. It doesn't think about technique anymore, and it's difficult to correct improper form learning at this stage. In other words, they are so advanced that the errors that they do have are very small and fine, therefore it makes them quite difficult to adjust and correct at this stage. You need really expert elite coaches to help do that. So it's just a case of adding a couple more things to each thing here, so we're just going to quickly do that now. So cognitive performers, it's mainly trial and error learning. You make mistakes, you learn from it, you get it right, you learn from it, so a lot of that goes on. And they are pretty much exclusively on extrinsic feedback, i.e. feedback from an outside source. They don't know if they're doing it right or wrong because they're beginners, so they need to be told if they're doing it right or wrong. And when you're given feedback from somebody else, that is extrinsic feedback. In contrast to that, an associative, the intermediate, I suppose if you want to call them that, performer, uses a combination of intrinsic and extrinsic feedback. So they still need feedback from an outside source, feedback from a coach, teammates, parents, but because they've got better technique and a better understanding, they can make use of intrinsic feedback, i.e. feedback from inside yourself. I bet you've all had an experience where when you've hit something or kicked something or tackled someone, you know whether you've got it right or wrong straight away by the way it sounded, the way it felt. That's intrinsic feedback. So the associative performers will make use of a combination of both of them. And finally, our autonomous performers, our high-level experts, they are nearly exclusively intrinsic feedback. Of course, they're still going to make use of extrinsic feedback. That's why pro teams still have coaches, still have managers, people to advise. But you watch most pros playing in any sport, they know themselves whether they've done it right or wrong, and they know pretty much how to correct it on the spot. So there are quite a few things about cognitive and associative and autonomous performers. What you need to be able to do is link these stages of performance to types of feedback and to types of guidance that would be used by coaches and things like that, and link it back to operant conditioning and observational learning. So you need to make sure you're aware of all of these theories of learning and everything that can be done to help performers. Also as well, don't be afraid to refer these back to different kind of practice methods and things like that. So, is it best to use whole or whole part whole with a cognitive performer? Well, probably it's better to use whole part whole, because as a beginner, it's best to break the skill down. Whereas with an autonomous performer, expert, you're probably best just using whole practice because they're more expert. They can use, they can understand and get a good idea for the entire skill. Equally, massed and distributed practice sessions, if you've watched the videos on those, a massed session has no breaks, whereas a distributed session has breaks. Well, autonomous will be able to handle mass practice sessions, because they've got the fitness, they've got the expertise, and they don't need as many breaks because they don't need as much extrinsic feedback. Whereas a cognitive performer will need a distributed session. They'll need more breaks for a fitness point of view to recover, and they'll also need breaks where you can give them lots of extrinsic feedback. So it's a case of knowing this and referring it to other aspects of the skill acquisition side of the paper. So finally then, it's not unknown and not uncommon for them to graph this kind of thing, this idea, these stages of learning. So again, like you say, what we've got here is time, and that could be 10,000 hours or 10 years, as we said at the start. And what you've got on the y-axis is quality of performance. So what we could do is something like this. And what we've got there is we have got cognitive performers at the early stage, associative performers intermediate stage, and autonomous performers at the top there. Sometimes you see, why is it quite a shallow graph here? Because it can take time as a cognitive performer to pick up knowledge of the new skills. Then you get a grasp of it and suddenly it starts to accelerate. Your learning gets quite good quite quickly. But then, like we said, by the time you get to autonomous, it's very few errors and very hard to correct because it's just fine tweaks, and that's why progress can slow down a little bit. So that's just the stages of learning in a graph form.